Instead of focusing on defense with the first round pick, could the Carolina Panthers decide to go all in on defense in free agency and then later on in the draft? On to that question among other listener questions on this weekly Friday mailbag edition of Locked On Panthers.
You are Locked On Panthers, your daily Carolina Panthers podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome into another edition of the Locked On Panthers podcast, a part of the Locked On Podcast Network. I'm your host, as always, Julian Council, talking Carolina Panthers with you every Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, and Friday. Your team every day. That's our motto here on the Locked On Podcast Network. Thanks for watching the show here on YouTube and listening wherever you listen to your favorite podcast. Be sure to follow me, Julian Council, over on Twitter at Julian Council, where on Fridays like today, throughout the entirety of the offseason, I'm right here answering your weekly Friday mailbag questions. All you got to do is either at me or DM me over on Twitter at Julian Council to get your questions in for the weekly Friday mailbag right here on Locked On Panthers. This episode of Locked On Panthers is brought to you by PrizePicks. Go to prizepicks.com/LockedOnNFL and use code all lowercase LockedOnNFL to win $50 instantly when you play $5. Let's get back into it. The second time this offseason, the weekly Friday mailbag is back, and we have plenty of questions about how the Panthers are going to approach the offseason here in 2024, as we don't have free agency for another 2 months, and we don't have the draft for also another 3 almost and a half months as well, but we'll get there eventually. And until we get there, I'll continue to answer your questions about those portions of the offseason. Let's lead off with Spencer, who wants to talk about the overall approach the Panthers are going to take potentially to this offseason, saying with the depth of defensive talent in free agency, such as Javon Holland, tackles like B.J. Hill, and a slew of DBs and linebackers like Dre Greenlaw, Nick Bolton, Carlton Davis, Javarius Ward, etc. Do you think that the Panthers can nab a name like that? Addressing wide receiver one again in the first round would be wise for Carolina if someone like Mason Graham or Abdul Carter is taken before we pick. So I guess my question is, thoughts on the Panthers using free agency and latter rounds to address the defense and instead use our first-round pick on someone like Teteroa McMillan to pair with Bryce Young rather than trading for Garrett Wilson or trying to get T. Higgins. Last Friday, we talked about the Garrett Wilson situation as he had Panther fans in a tizzy last week after tweeting about how well Bryce Young played in the second half of the season and saying how he's a good player. And, you know, the situation in New York, the Jets isn't great. They're hiring a new general manager. They are talking to literally everybody who is interested in this job. I could even get an interview at this point in time. That's how many people the Jets are interviewing for that GM job. Then they got to hire a head coach and figure out whether they want to keep Aaron Rodgers around. And my guess is, considering the owner, Woody Johnson, wanted to bench Aaron Rodgers midway through the season. Aaron Rodgers likely not going to be back in New York, which is going to put the quarterback situation in question, which is already in question as is, even with Rodgers if he starts next season. And does Garrett Wilson want to sit through all of that? Now, we talked to Mike Kay earlier this week of the Charlotte Observer. He talked about why would the Jets do that, and he said if the Jets GM trades Garrett Wilson for anything short of the first pick, they should be fired immediately. I don't necessarily see it happening. Mike doesn't see it happen, but maybe it will. As far as getting Higgins, like, that's still my priority if you're looking at if you want to elevate that wide receiver room. Now, Mike's talking about raising the floor. Let's raise the ceiling. Let's raise the roof as far as it goes with the Panthers wide receiver core. And I would love for them to be aggressive and to get T. Higgins. But I understand they have a ton of needs defensively, and this is the worst defense we have ever seen in franchise history. And clearly, they're not placing the blame on Ejiro Evero. They did fire a couple of staffers, and they're likely going to move on from a lot of guys who played on that defense this past season, but it's not all on the scheme. They know they got to get better players, and Dan Morgan will certainly be aggressive, but smart, but aggressive in trying to address those needs this offseason. Like, if they can go out there, like, I don't know if they need a Dre Greenlaw or Nick Bolton. Those are linebackers. They have Trevin Wallace and Josie Jewell coming back. So I don't think they necessarily need starting linebackers to come in here. And Greenlaw, he came off of that Achilles tear in the Super Bowl didn't play a lot down the stretch for San Francisco. So I don't know if that's who you're looking for. You talk about Javon Holland at safety. That certainly would make sense, as all three of the Panthers safeties plus Sam Franklin are all free agents right now. So you got to fill out that entire room. And I don't know if you're bringing back Jordan Fuller after he was a healthy scratch to the final 3 weeks of the season in favor of undrafted free agent rookie out of A&M, Damani Richardson. So he's likely done. Maybe Nick Scott, who Mike talked about, could come back as a special teamer, not someone you're calling upon to play. Same thing with Sam Franklin. Xavier Woods probably done in Carolina. Maybe he comes back. We'll see. But yeah, if you can land a name like Javon Holland or get BJ Hill as your defensive tackle to come in and step in and start right there with Ashawn Robinson and with Derek Brown, you may be in a situation where, yeah, you don't need Mason Graham per se there in the first round. And Abdul Carter, I don't think he's going to be available at 8, but if he is, yeah, you take him. If he's not, and if you have not addressed wide receiver, possibly you have, but you haven't gotten that top end guy, maybe you go after Teteroa McMillan out of Arizona. Maybe you go after, I think that might be a little bit too high for Emeka Egbuka. You look at Luther Burden from Mizzou, probably also a little bit too high there at 8. I don't know. I don't think, though, that should be the position they're looking at. Like, if they are able to address DB, in particular safety, and probably corner as well, they get a defensive tackle, and you get to the draft and Mason Graham and Abdul Carter are gone, cool. But like, there's Jalen Walker, right, out of Georgia, the edge rusher. There's Michael Williams. Why not get an edge rusher, a position of obvious need, opposed to getting a wide receiver? And I don't believe that Xavier Legette will ever be a wide receiver 1. I didn't believe it last year leading up to the draft. Didn't believe it after they drafted him. And certainly after watching the season, don't believe that to be the case. Not saying that he cannot be a good player for Carolina, but like I asked you yesterday when we were talking about Xavier Legette and whether Dan Morgan made the wrong decision to take him there in the first round at 32, of all the guys taken in the first round, who can you say Xavier Legette will be better than down the road? Who can you say? That's the one question I have. And even behind him, Ladd McConkey is clearly a better player and going to be a better player. Keon Coleman is going to have a better quarterback situation guaranteed moving forward, because Josh Allen, I don't know if Bryce Young's ever going to be what Josh Allen is right now. So that's a pretty high bar to reach, and he's going to have a chance to be successful. So there's a lot of things that go around it, which is a big reason why people were making excuses, or at least adding nuance to what happened in his 5 years down in Columbia for Xavier Legette. I just don't see him as wide receiver 1. So you got it wrong last year, potentially. Well, I think you definitely got it wrong last year. I don't know if there was that, I guess, McConkey, but they didn't get the right guy last year. And this is not as deep as a receiver class as far as the high-end talent there in the first round. Looking at the most recent mock draft from Dane Brugler of The Athletic, he had 4 receivers going in the first round. Last year, 6 went in the first round, 8 in the first 34 picks. I don't know if that's going to be the case this year. Maybe it is, maybe it won't. But I don't know if their best thing for them to do is to get a wide receiver 1 potentially there at 8. Like, that's just my thought. Again, without knowing what they're doing in free agency. And even without knowing what they're doing in free agency, still to me, probably this is not the draft to do that. So we'll see how that all plays out as far as what their approach could possibly be. What about a wide receiver in the second round? What about Chris Godwin coming in and being that top end wide receiver for the Carolina Panthers? We'll talk about that here in just a moment on Locked on Panthers. It's playoff time, and if you're like me, you want to make the most of these final weeks of football action. That's where PrizePicks comes in. If you love football and want a chance to win real money while watching the games, PrizePicks is the place for you. It's the best way to turn your sports opinions into cash with daily fantasy player projections. With PrizePicks, you simply pick more or less on player stat types like passing yards or rushing touchdowns, and for a shot to win up to 1,000 times your money, you can make your picks in less than 60 seconds. And whether you're looking for a flex play to boost your payout or want to cash out quickly, PrizePicks has got you covered. And with over 10 million members and billions in winnings, it's clear that people are loving this platform. Here's a special offer for Locked On Panther listeners like you. Download the app today and use code LOCKEDONNFL to get $50 instantly after you play your first $5 lineup. That's PrizePicks. Run your game. Download the app today and use code LOCKEDONNFL to get $50 instantly after you play your first $5 lineup. That's PrizePicks. Run your game. We have a lot of time until we find out what the Panthers are going to do in free agency, as that's still 2 months away, and the draft is 3 months plus away as well. And until I see what they do in free agency, it's going to be really, really hard for me to say what they should and maybe will do in the draft. But keep asking questions. I'll try to answer them to my best abilities. But again, that's why I tell you, let's see what they do as far as that's why I'm not talking about it on the shows right now. Like, I'm revisiting things that happened last year, and we've seen how those played out. I'm going to start doing some breakdowns of the positions and going in free and see like what they may do. Like me answering questions as far as like, hey, like what do you? I don't know. I'm gonna answer them the best I can, but I really don't know. And just gotta be honest and just tell you all that we can talk about it. You can ask. I'll answer them. But I don't know a lot of these answers to give you. I don't really know what to say a lot of times. Glenn got a question about the draft as well. What do you think about drafting a wide receiver in the second round? I know it seems like every year we say the wide receiver class is deep. However, this year really seems as if it is. I think a player like Matthew Golden from Texas, who can play X, Y, and Z, is an elite option for a second round pick. Someone who can line up anywhere and has proven to do so. I think we both can agree we shouldn't use our first round pick on a wide receiver, but I think if someone like that falls, it is a much needed upgrade. So looking at the second round, thanks to that trade we talked about earlier this week when revisiting Brian Burns and that whole trade situation, maybe the best thing to come out of that was the fact that the Carolina Panthers now have a second-round pick in this 2025 NFL draft, something they did not have because their second-round pick, which is pick 39, belongs to the Chicago Bears. That is the final piece of trade compensation from the trade a couple of years ago the Panthers made to get up to number 1 to select Bryce Young. So instead of drafting at 39 or not at all, the Panthers will be drafting at 57 as of right now. That may change depending on what the Los Angeles Rams, who wanted to get up to get Braden Fisk there with Carolina last year, depends on what they end up doing. I do not believe they're gonna go on the road and beat Philadelphia, but if they do, then the Panthers can be drafting even further back there in the second round. And it's unfortunate because early in the season, I think it's a good thing that the Rams were able to get healthy and bounce back and have the season that they wanted to have. For the Panthers, it's not the best thing as they were banged up. The Rams were earlier on in the year, and they were looking like, oh, this is going to be a team that's going to be drafting in the top 10 this year. And of course, that's very much so not the case unless they're going to trade up to get in the top 10. And that has hurt Carolina in the second round. But they have a second round pick, no less, which is important. Looking at it as far as like receivers go, like Travis Hunter, Tedero McMillan, Luther Burden, Emeka Buka. Those are the only guys projected in the first round, according to Dane Brugler of Athletic, who just put out a mock draft on Wednesday. Last year, 8 receivers were taken in the first 34 picks, including 6 in the first round. And looking at Dane Brugler's latest 2-round mock, he has Matthew Golden going in the second round to the New Orleans Saints at 40th overall. Panthers, again, drafting at 57. Houston Texans taking Trey Harris, wide receiver out of Ole Miss. The Commanders taking Alec Ayomanor out of Stanford. And then the Chiefs taking Jaden Higgins out of Iowa State. So possibly the Panthers could get a second-round wide receiver. But considering how well Matthew Golden played, especially if you – and by the way, Glenn's a Texas fan. This is not Glenn Powell, by the way, but this is just a different Glenn. But Glenn is a Texas fan. He said hook him after this. And if you looked at how the way Golden played in a stretch run for Texas, I look at this guy as someone who's clearly going to be drafted in the first couple of picks of the second round, maybe sneaks in depending on how he does throughout the combine, his pro day and all of that. He may end up being a first-round pick. He was excellent, and it hurt Texas a week ago when he was dealing with that foot injury. He got stepped on. It might have been like a foot and an ankle. Got stepped on in that game against Ohio State. Had to leave, had to come back. Just wasn't the same guy, but he was huge for them in that game against Arizona State. Was huge for them against Clemson. Even in the loss to Georgia in the SEC title game, he became their number 1. It was supposed to be Isaiah Bolden, who transferred from Alabama, but then he was dealing with some injuries, and that's a guy who left. And I mean, he's not projected to go in the second round, so I don't know what he's doing leaving Austin. He could just stay there and keep driving the Lambo that they gave him. Instead, he's going to NFL and maybe not get drafted in the first 3 rounds, which would be quite a shock for someone who chased the bag last year instead of just staying his ass in Tuscaloosa. But I don't think Golden's going to be there. I don't necessarily hate the idea of trying to get a receiver there, but I think, again, I'd rather them get an experienced player in free agency and then think about some other spots in the draft. But yeah, Trey Harris liked him at Ole Miss. Alec Ayermanner liked him. We'll see what they do. But yeah, this is a pick that it might keep getting worse, but it's good that they have a second round pick in the first place. So maybe it's something that they decide to do. But again, you need to see how free agency plays out, and then you see what the board looks like to really have an idea of if it makes any sense at all. Right now, to me, I don't really think it makes any sense at all with Leggett coming back, having Coker, Thielen if he decides not to retire, and then if you add another experienced receiver during free agency, yeah, I don't think getting a second round receiver would make a lot of sense in that situation. But again, let's see how it plays out. All right, over to Tyler. There's a question about Chris Godwin saying, do you think it makes more sense for the Panthers to target Chris Godwin as their free agent wide receiver target? He has already played under Dave Canales, and the injuries are a concern, of course, but he has been very productive in the league and is familiar with the system. Most importantly, he'll be a way cheaper price tag option than T. Higgins or a Garrett Wilson trade. Also, could Kyle Trask be a good option as a cheap backup quarterback, familiar with Dave Canales' system, and has potential as a former second-round pick? I got to do a better job of editing these once you guys send them. I usually just copy-paste, and that is never the best thing. Okay, Kyle Trask has the athleticism of an oak tree. He can't move. So, no, I'm all good there. As far as Godwin goes, I think he's awesome. I think it sucks, the injury that he had, and we'll see how he's able to bounce back off of that. If you saw, it was like one of those like ankle dislocation fracture things that have become way too common. We've seen a lot of them recently, so I really don't want to see any more of those happen in football, but they're going to keep happening. He's coming off of that. He's going to be 29 next year, so he's still a relatively young option. He's under 30, of course, and is a good player. I don't know about cheap though, because looking at this receiver market, T is the top option. That's going to cost a lot of money. But you got guys like Stephon Diggs coming off an ACL. You got Keenan Allen up there in Chicago, who's older. There aren't a lot of younger proven options available. And this is going to be probably the first time, I think, that Chris Godwin actually gets to hit free agency potentially. There will be teams out there willing to pay. And his deal that Spot Track is out here putting out there, 3 years, $67 million. That's $22.5 million average annual salary. That's not cheap. So it's going to cost money if they want to get somebody, which is, I think, why Mike talked about go find a cheaper option. I don't love the whole bargain bin shopping, especially if they missed on their first round receiver last year, as far as that guy being the guy long term. Maybe he'll be the guy eventually. I just don't see it yet. Never have, never probably will. I would like for them to get someone proven, even if he's coming off an injury. Maybe that is something that allows Panthers not to spend that much. Maybe a team wants to do the whole prove it deal. I don't really think Chris Godwin's got to prove anything. The guy's a good player. It's just hopefully he recovers well enough to where that's not going to be an issue for whoever he plays for next year. So, yeah, maybe I wouldn't hate it, but Kyle Trask, nah, I'm all good there. All right, take a quick pause, come back, answer more of your weekly Friday mailbag questions right here on Locked On Panthers. This is a message from our sponsor, Intuit TurboTax. Are you tired of the endless waiting, wondering, and worrying about your taxes? Well, now that's a thing of the past. You see, taxes don't need to be complicated or stressful. TurboTax is here to change the game by matching you with a TurboTax expert who can get to work on your return right away. No more waiting for answers. No more wondering if you're missing out on deductions. Whether you've got one form or 20, TurboTax experts give your taxes their undivided attention while you get real-time updates on their progress so you can focus on what really matters. You won't have to lift a finger, but you'll get the peace of mind knowing that your taxes are being handled by the pros. Ready for stress-free taxes and the most money back guaranteed? Head over to TurboTax.com today and get matched with your expert who's ready to take your taxes off your plate so you can focus on your day. Only available with TurboTax Live full service, real-time updates only in the iOS mobile app. See guarantee details at TurboTax.com/guarantees. A few more questions here on this weekly Friday mailbag edition of Locked On Panthers. Over to Chuck now, who says, since we've decided to keep Ejiro Evero in his 3-4 scheme, what current free agent defensive players could you see fitting well and maybe even being key contributors to a defensive turnaround in 2025 while considering our salary cap situation? Well, right now we don't know what the salary cap situation is going to be for the Carolina Panthers. It's projected right now by overthecap.com to be $21.6 million. But understand this, there are avenues for Dan Morgan and also for Brant Tillis to go out there and to open up more cap space. One of the opportunities is right there top of the list is Taylor Moton has a $31.3 million cap hit. And what the Panthers could easily do to open up some money is to extend him. And that would open up $12.9, nearly $13 million for them. If they want to restructure his deal for the fourth straight offseason, that opens up $12 million. So I do think an extension, talking about that with Mike K earlier this week, makes the most sense for Taylor Moton and for the Carolina Panthers. There's other guys like Derek Brown, possibly they do a restructure there. I don't know if that makes sense, but that's $9 million they can open up. Robert Hunt, if they want to restructure, that's $11 million they can open up. So if we talk about a Moton extension, a Hunt restructure, that's $24 million right there. And they do Derek Brown as well. That's $9 more million. So we're looking at 33 plus 21. That's 55. And then you add like the other hundreds of thousands of dollars in there. It's probably $56 million cap space that Carolina opens up right then and there. And then we talk about there's guys that they should clearly cut. Shai Tuttle, there we go. So that's about $59 million that they could open up right there. J.C. Horn, if they extend him right now, he's got a $12 million cap hit because of the whole situation with his the fifth-year option. They extend JC. That's $9 million that they've opened up. So now we're up to $68 million. And then we still got to cut. Who else needs to be cut by the Panthers? If they sign Corbett, that can bring down the money as far as his the dead cap that they have on his deal. Well, actually, no, it doesn't bring anything down. So they're going to still have to deal with that with the void year with his contract. Looking at other guys, so like, yeah, I got up to like $68 million, and we'll see if that's how much they have. But there's ways for them to open up the cap space. So I don't know what the situation is going to be. I know what it's projected to be as of right now, but overthecap.com. But again, there are ways that Carolina can open up some space. Now, looking at some areas of need, defensive tackle, clearly, like Shai Tuttle, get rid of him. You're going to need to go bring in somebody else who's experienced and certainly better. We talked about this. Javon Hargrave could make some sense. BJ Hill could make sense. Jaron Reed could make sense. Puna Ford, those four all could make sense here in Carolina. Safety, they're losing all four of their safeties as Xavier Woods a free agent, Nick Scott's free agent, Jordan Fuller's a free agent. You look at also Sam Franklin Jr., and you may be saying, well, Damani Richardson, okay, fine. But as far as the guys that they went into the season thinking were going to be their top four, all four of them are gone. And we knew that all the way back in August, that this was going to be a scenario for Carolina. The best thing is that Damani Richardson was able to take one of those starting jobs. That's one less situation in the safety room you got to worry about heading into free agency. But Trevon Moehrig is somebody that Mike brought up earlier this week. Javon Holland as well. Those are two guys that they potentially could try to go after. And in that corner, like Mike Jackson, you got him coming back. You would have to re-sign him, but I would think that would make sense to bring him back. So yeah, that's some of the guys they could look at, and they could potentially get to like $50-60 million in cap space with a couple of moves that they possibly could make, just looking at overthecap.com. And if they do all this whole restructures and extensions, that would definitely help them heading in free agency as far as cap space goes. Over now to Mark, who says every year the draft is deep in some position groups and shallow in others. This needs to be taken into account before signing free agents. Absolutely. That's why you have Senior Bowl. That's why you have the Combine. You get a look at all these guys, and then you can think about what do you want to do? Because the Combine is at the end of February. The Senior Bowl, I think, is coming up like next week, right? It's the week, I believe, in between the championship weekend and the draft or whatever it is. I don't know what it is, or not the draft, but the Super Bowl. So maybe it's in 2 weeks. Either way, those are two opportunities rather, for every team to go get their eyes on some players and be with their scouts and then decide what the board could look like for them as they head into free agency, just knowing if we miss on these positions, this is where we can go. Now, going back to what Mark is saying, this year's is loaded with top end edge rushers and has a lot of depth at cornerback, wide receiver, running back, and shockingly centers. The free agent market has a plethora of good safeties. So what is your strategy when it comes to spending limited dollars on free agents? So again, went over this just with Chuck and with all of you. Could possibly get up to 68 if they do all the things I talked about there. I don't know if they're going to, if they should, but if they did, that's a decent amount of money they can open up. Don't know what the cap space situation is going to be. But you are right about the edge rushers. Looking back at Dane Brugler and his latest mock draft, he had 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 edge rushers going in the first round. Abdul Carter from Penn State, Jalen Walker from Georgia, Michael Williams from Georgia, James Pierce Jr., Charlotte native from Tennessee, Mike Green from Marshall, JT Tuimoloau. Yeah, there we go. JT Tuimoloau out of Ohio State, the Ohio State University. Nick Scorton out of Texas A&M by way of Purdue. Those are the 7 that he had. And then, yeah, I mean, receiver, we went over, let's see, 4 in the first round if you want to count Travis Hunter. So Travis Hunter, Tedero McMillan, Luther Burden, and Emeka Egbuka. And then earlier when we talked about the 4th round or the 2nd round guys, Golden, Harris, A.O. Manor, and Higgins. So it's 8 in the first 2 rounds, which I think will be less than what they did last year, at least 8. I mean, it was top-end receiving talent last year. I don't know how much top-end receiving talent there is this season. I don't know. My strategy would be I talked about, let's see. Let's go back to the checklist as far as the offseason to-do list for the Panthers that I went over, I believe, a week ago. I had down – I want a defensive tackle in free agency. I think that makes sense. Drafting a corner, I think, makes sense. Acquiring a safety, whether that's a draft free agency, I think probably you need to go get an experienced guy if you're going to bring back Monty Richardson. And then, of course, draft an edge rusher. Just be smart, be aggressive. But, man, that's kind of my approach. That's the approach that Dan Morgan laid out. It's still difficult to truly answer this without knowing what they're going to do in free agency to know. I don't know. As far as free agent dollars, spend them wisely. Spend them on guys that have a proven track record. I don't want to necessarily just be like in the bargain bin. Go pay money like you did last year for guys like Damian Lewis and for Robert Hunt, who are proven commodities at their position. Go get proven starters. Go get guys who are coming off of good years. Don't get guys who weren't doing anything. Like that's my strategy, I think, just spending limited dollars. Another question comes from someone whose name I didn't get. Do you see a scenario, or is it feasible for the Panthers trade out for Travis Hunter? What would the composition be? Well, they'd have to, of course, swap their first round pick this year, and they'd have to give up a pretty high pick next year if a team is on the board and Travis Hunter's right there. I don't think it's a feasible situation. He's probably going to go. He's the best player in the draft. He is. And I don't think he makes it past 3. So do you want to trip to 3? And who's sitting up there at 3 right now? Looking over at tankathon.com, the Giants. So, Cleveland could take a quarterback. Deshaun had that setback. I think it was this week with the Achilles tear. I don't think Travis Hunter makes it past 3. Definitely doesn't make it past 4 with New England. You put him and Christian Gonzalez, and then you give Drake May a receiver as well. Yeah, so, no, I don't think it's feasible. Sorry. All right. That's going to wrap up this edition of the Locked On Panthers podcast, part of Locked On Podcast Network, hosted by yours truly, Julian Council. Again, y'all, subscribe or follow the show for free on YouTube or wherever you listen to your favorite podcast. And be sure to follow me, Julian Council, over on Twitter at Julian Council, where on Fridays, like today, I answer your weekly Friday mailbag questions throughout the offseason, either at me or DM me over on Twitter at Julian Council to get those questions into me for next week's show. In the meantime, be safe, be happy, be whole. As always, keep pounding. And on Monday, I'll be back to great Dan Morgan's free agent signings from this past year here on Locked On Panthers.